I'm David Lombardo, and you're listening to WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. We're continuing to get to know the new faces who will be heading to Albany in January, and on this episode, we're checking in with attorney David Siffert, who won a crowded Democratic primary in June for a downtown Manhattan assembly seat, which had been represented by the retiring incumbent, Deborah Glick, for more than 3 decades. David was initially trailing on election night, but after all the votes were counted and there was a recount, they won the race by 15 votes. Things are expected to be much smoother in November when they don't have a Republican opponent on the ballot. For more of our conversations with the new faces who will be joining the state legislature in 2027, check out our archives at capitolpressroom.org or wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Thanks so much for making the time, David, and congrats on your primary victory.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So you're not a newcomer to state government, but before you take office, your work has been either as an advocate or writing legislation behind the scenes primarily. Have you always wanted to be the person in the room where it happens, so to speak, or was there something unique about the circumstances of 2026 that changed your career trajectory and what you were interested in?
I think I've, for a very long time, been interested in legislation and figuring out a career that lets me be hands-on with legislation is something that's always been interesting to me. I've never had my heart set on running for office. It's not something that I was, ever said I would never do, but it's not something, if you talk to anybody in my neighborhood, it's not something that I've been doing. I've not been running for a long time or anything like that. I was actually very happy with the jobs I had. I was, the legal director of a group called the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, where I got to draft bills I really like and work with legislators to try to get them passed. And then I taught this state legislative externship at NYU, where I helped students work with legislators to draft legislation. And I really enjoyed all of that. And the only problem is that none of the bills were passing, honestly. I was getting increasingly frustrated. I was describing it at the end as feeling like a fan fiction legislator. I was writing all these bills that I thought were so great, some of which I didn't even think were that politically controversial, and they weren't moving, or they were, and then something came up that pissed me off. And I think 2025 was a particularly frustrating year for me with state legislation. And at the end of feeling very frustrated that I had put in a huge amount of work without much result, Deborah Glick announced she was retiring, and I sort of was frustrated enough to go for it.
Well, then what are your expectations in 2027 and 2028 as it pertains to your ability to move some of these stalled bills? Because if you have been around the process for a while like you have, you know that it's tough for a newcomer to make a big difference. So what sort of level setting are you doing? What sort of expectations are you setting for yourself, at least early on?
I've been involved in the process long enough to know a lot of legislators, a lot of assembly members. I've seen firsthand how frustrated they get when their bills don't move. So I have some degree of reasonable expectations in that sense. I've also seen that even the most frustrated assembly members are still passing multiple bills a year. And in 2025, none of the bills that I worked hard on drafting passed. One bill that I worked hard on the advocacy for did move. But, that's a big difference with being a legislator, is that even in a frustrating year, you can still make important changes. And I've also seen that even junior assembly members can be effective. Alex Boras, in his first 4 years, passed a lot of really important bills and made a lot of really important changes. And that's just one example off the top of my head. But even relatively early on, I think it's possible to get things through and make things happen if you are effective. And I hope I'm going to be effective. I'm talking to people who I think have been effective to try to learn how they've done it.
What feedback have you gotten so far about how other lawmakers have been effective, and have you thought about what your approach will be to building consensus or the issues that you think you can be effective on?
I'm a good faith negotiator. I think of myself as a reasonable negotiator, and I like the process of negotiation. And I don't get mad if someone doesn't share my opinion or doesn't want to do the thing that I want to do. all of that winds up very helpful. I think the context of every bill is very different, and what's going to be effective for every bill is very different. You have some bills that are really driven, for example, by a group of directly impacted people. And negotiating a bill like that is going to look different than negotiating a wonky bill that was drafted by a professor versus something that, one of my constituents wants. And making sure that the right people are included in the process of the negotiation is really important. So, yeah, you've got different processes. I can't say there's going to be a one size fits all, but I look forward to negotiating legislation. It's something that I like to do, and hopefully will make me better at it because I have legal and drafting skills, but I also am not such a when I was a college student, I was probably a true believer in a lot of things that would make me much less willing to compromise. But now I've seen the reality on the ground and the way that compromise can make bills better. And even when it doesn't make bills better, it's still often better than nothing. Not always. And it's important to remember that the answer is not always. The compromise can sometimes make the situation worse than the status quo. But yeah, figuring that out is important.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. I'm David Lombardo, and we're speaking with David Siffert, who won a crowded Democratic primary in June for a downtown Manhattan assembly seat, which has been represented by the retiring incumbent Deborah Glick for more than 3 decades. You mentioned Assemblymember Alex Borez earlier. He's been a leader in the AI big tech space, and he's not going to be back in 2027. And as you also mentioned, your resume includes time as legal director for the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. So do you want to play some sort of role in the chamber as a leading voice on the regulation of big tech and AI more specifically?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, leading role has some heavy implications, but I think that it's really important that we regulate AI and big tech. I think we're in a moment right now where the impacts on our society are pretty huge, that it's a largely unregulated area, that harms are already cropping up, and it's extremely easy to see how things are going to get worse if we don't put some safeguards in place. There are some people who are already focused on the issue in the legislature. I want to be a person who's focused on the issue. I also have some expertise in it because I've worked professionally on tech policy for years now.
And that's
And I
I mean,
hope that
that's kind of don't underrate that, because while there are people in the legislature who are on these issues, I don't think they necessarily bring the same level of expertise that you probably have walking in the door on day one.
yeah, um, I don't want to walk in on day one and say what levels of expertise all my colleagues have. Um, but I will say that I think that Alex Boras's expertise, coming from a computer science background, coming from a tech background, coming into the legislature, made him substantially more effective in being able to move tech regulation. And the RAISE Act is obviously the marquee bill of his in that area. I don't think that would have passed had we not had someone there with Alex's level of expertise. So I'm hopeful that bringing a level of expertise on the issues will be helpful in a similar way.
Well, you're joining an Assembly Democratic majority that will have a lot of turnover from 2026 to 2027, including doubling the size of the Democratic Socialists and some establishment Democrats not returning. And in light of what you just said about your own sort of evolution, how you might have been more of a true believer back in college and how you have come to see the reality of the political process, where do you see yourself in the sort of evolving dynamic of the Assembly Democratic majority? Could you try to drop yourself in that landscape ideologically?
Yeah, I always, for the general public, I feel like there's, stereotypical types of Democrats. There's the, like, Zoran, Bernie Sanders lane. There's the Elizabeth Warren, Brad Lander lane. There's maybe like Joe Biden, Eric Adams type of a more moderate lane. And I've always sort of identified in the second of those as as a progressive who's not a socialist. I think that, probably not surprising anyone, that New York has been a pretty establishment state for a long time, and that the balance of powers is relatively moderate and has been for a while. Um, and so I anticipate working pretty closely with people, DSA members of the Assembly and the Senate, um, to push for a lot of things that we all want, that all progressives want. That runs from taxing and spending issues to criminal legal reform issues, and so um, there's two different questions, I guess. One is what kinds of policies we're going to support, and the other is what kinds of tactics we're going to deploy. And I don't want to speak for anyone else. I'll just say for me, I will probably support a lot of the more progressive policies that are going up, if not close to all of them. Um, I hope to deploy tactics that are productive, that develop good working relationships with my colleagues, with the governor and her team, people who are more moderate than I am, because I think that's a more effective way of getting. For me, I think is I am more effective when I'm doing that. Though other people may feel that other tactics are more effective for them.
As far as I'm aware, you'll be the first openly non-binary member of the state legislature here in New York. How do you think your identity will inform some of your goals as an assembly member, and how do you think it might impact your day-to-day experience here in the Capitol with your new colleagues?
I'm not exactly sure how it'll affect my experience with my colleagues. My suspicion is not that much. I think partially because I haven't talked about it that much, but I've always sort of identified a little bit more a gender side of non-binary, which means that in some ways it's less important to me. I don't spend as much time expressing gender, I guess I'll say. And so I think it's pretty easy for people not to think about it when interacting with me, which is fine by me because I generally don't want to be thinking about it. And I wish that the whole world could go, I wish that every trans and non-binary person could spend a lot more time not thinking about it. So hopefully it won't impact my experience with my colleagues that much, but certainly it'll impact, for example, things I'm pushing for, seeing in my neighborhood kids being denied healthcare due to a bigoted federal government and a hospital system that is bending at the knee has been really upsetting. And, we saw both the city and the state fail to put the necessary money aside for a gender affirming care fund. That's going to be something that's going to be a priority for me to make sure that, kids in my district and around the state have access to the healthcare they need.
Yeah, you mentioned the idea of gender affirming care, and what we're seeing is these healthcare institutions who are basically terrified of jeopardizing federal dollars. What do you think the answer is at the state level? Is it essentially just backfilling the potential lost federal money?
I mean, there's a number of different things that I don't think we necessarily have to pick one thing. I don't, I'm sure there's a reason for it, but I don't understand why there hasn't been a lawsuit for a declaratory judgment that these regulations are unconstitutional and illegal, so that hospitals can continue to provide this care without worrying that they're going to lose their federal dollars. This is exactly why we have declaratory judgment actions to say, like, tell me in advance so I don't wind up in huge legal trouble, but I think this law is unconstitutional. I'm sure there's a reason that this hasn't been brought yet, or maybe it has been brought and it just hasn't bubbled all its way up through the courts. But that's, like a step one. I do think we need to fill in the funding gap. I also think we need to fund standalone clinics that that don't take federal money, and that needs to be. I mean, we have some of them, but we have very few, and it's certainly not enough to provide for all of New York City, much less all of New York State. And they're not always easily accessible, and information about them is not always easily available. And so some of it's funding, some of it's building out infrastructure, and some of it's legal challenges, I would say.
Well, finally, you won the Democratic primary by, I think, 15 votes. There was recounts involved with the process. And based on what you went through, has that made New York's election process something you'd like to revisit as a state lawmaker? Are there changes that you think are necessary to the process?
Yes, I absolutely do. I think there's a lot of changes necessary to the process. I think that the election that I went through just now was a fair election. I think the votes were counted. I don't think, we've seen examples where it wasn't like that. There was a few years ago upstate where, ballots were like left in a drawer and it changed the result of the race. There have been some really grim problems. And so I think we do need reform of our boards of elections. And there has been a lot of pushes for that. With the Brennan Center has done a lot of work on it. It's mostly stalled in the Assembly, is my understanding. Liz Kruger has a really important bill on the New York City Board of Elections. I think there's a lot of things we can do to make voting easier and more accessible. The idea that there's no reason with current technology, with ballot printing, the things that we have in early voting, that you should have to vote only in your own polling place. It seems like in New York City, you should be able to go to any polling place in the city, get your ballot printed, and vote. So there are things we can do to make voting easier. There's infrastructure things with our boards of elections that I think we can do to make voting better. I'm a big proponent of ranked choice voting personally. I think it helps in a lot of races where people think, oh, this candidate isn't viable, but they're my top candidate. It allows those candidates to be competitive. I have even more out there things that I think, which I'm happy to say out loud. Like, if I would just have a ranked choice general election and do away with primaries. Why make people go to the ballot box twice in a year if you have ranked choice voting? Not going to happen. I wish I could say, I'm not going to make that a priority for me because that's just a pipe dream. But bringing ranked choice voting into state elections like we have it in New York City could be probably a long-term project that I would like to make happen.
Well, we've been speaking with David Siffert. They are the Democratic nominee and presumptive next representative for the 66th Assembly District in downtown Manhattan. David, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
And for additional conversations with some of the new faces who will be joining Albany in 2027, check out our audio archives at capitalpressroom.org or wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Thanks for listening to today's edition of the Capitol Press Room. For an insider take on what's happening in state government, check out our Dispatches from Planet Albany show, available wherever you get podcasts or at capitalpressroom.org.
Join us again for Capitol Press Room, a production of WCNY Connected, Syracuse.